It is my great joy to introduce to fellow leaders David Thomas. David is a man that I met a few weeks ago at an event I was at in London. David was part of a team of people who stewarded what the Lord did in Asbury back at the beginning of 2023. And I had a brief conversation and connection with David there at this event in London. And as soon as I heard his heart, I thought, this is a man we can learn much from in all that we're longing to see God do in Cardiff and in Wales. And so it's a great joy to have you join us in this way, David. I'm so grateful that you make time for this conversation. Why don't you start just by telling us a little bit more about yourself? And I'd love for you to just tell us anything that connects you to Wales as a bit of context as well.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, and it's an absolute delight to be with you and all the leaders that are gathered into this conversation. And thank you so much for the invitation. And I do work with an initiative, Asbury Theological Seminary, which is across the street from the university where the outpouring happened. And this initiative focuses on spiritual awakening in leaders, churches, and cities. And it's called New Room, which, of course, is taken from the building in Bristol, not too far from you there in Cardiff. That was the first building of the Methodist movement and of that awakening in 18th century England. And we took our name. We're sort of stirring and moving in this hope across the whole Pan-Wesleyan family in the United States. And so we wanted to just take that name as a gesture toward those sacred origins of awakening. But those words mean more to us, that we're just nothing but a fellowship of thirsty Christians, honest enough to admit that we are desperate for God to do something new in our day. And we're willing to do whatever it takes to give him the room in our lives to do it. New room. So that's what I am a part of. And you know this, Owen, I love Wales. And I did a PhD at Bristol, and I was making these 2 trips a year for supervision. And I kind of stumbled my way across the West, across Cardiff, all the way to the Pembrokeshire coast. And when I got to St. David's, I fell in love. And I've probably been to St. David's at least 15 times, and probably lots more than that. And I love to take the walks on that Pembrokeshire coast and to stay there. And I just go and walk and pray. And it is a place, honestly, I could tell you story upon story about how God has met me there. It is my thinnest of thin places. And I've done some wonderful camping in the Brecon Beacons and so many other parts around Wales. I love the people. I love the story of the Welsh revival. I love the Celtic Christian story. So it might be in a romantic view of Wales that I have, but it is also a genuine affection. And so nothing could draw my heart together more than my wife and children than the hope of awakening in Wales. The 2 things I love. So thank you for the privilege of getting to talk a little bit about that today. It's just a joy.
Oh, it's our privilege. And honestly, you sound like a true Welshman. If you've got a romantic picture of Wales, that's what it means to be a Welshman.
Exactly.
And of course, David Thomas, as I said to you when we met.
I know, look at that.
It's a pretty good Welsh
the name itself is,
so maybe David, one day, maybe the Lord would have you come and fulfill that romanticism to a greater degree. But anyway, that's wonderful to hear. And I guess that leads us on then to one of the reasons I'd love to have you speak into us as leaders here in Wales and in Cardiff particularly, is we would have heard of the Asbury outpouring that took place 16 days in the university there over in Kentucky. And as with many others, I'm sure, in the Western world, we were eagerly watching at the beginning of 23, rejoicing that God seemed to be moving in a particular and peculiar way amongst these young people. You were one of the leaders who in the background was stewarding what the Lord was doing there. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of your unique vantage point of what was it like to be part of that 16 days in February 2023?
Yeah, thank you. You're right. I mean, this is Asbury University, Wilmore, Kentucky, little town, that's unknown, and a school that it has compulsory chapel Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 a.m. And this was one chapel where a young man was speaking close to, and afterward, several students didn't want to leave, and they just stayed at the altar. Nothing, unusual about that. That about 2 hours later, they were still there, and he texted me again, and I came down, and we just began observing. And about 4:30, this went on, about another 3 or 4 hours. So about 4:30 in the afternoon, a young woman was kneeling at the altar, and she stood up and sat on the altar and faced people in the room. And there may be 75 students or so there. And she just said to the room, "I know that I've been mean to you. I've not treated you well. And my parents are getting a divorce, and they're both alcoholics. And I'm so afraid I'm going to grow up to be just like them. So last week I went out to High Bridge, which is an old derelict rail bridge near the campus, and I was going to jump, and I got a call, and it stopped me. But she said, "I'm a ghost on this campus. No one knows me." And there was a long pause, and I realized right then, okay, that's the voice of a generation: anxious, depressed, suicidal, broken family, alone. And of course, the students moved toward her and began to pray with her. And that broke open into all of them just starting to grow raw, so open about their real lives, just bringing that to Jesus. And then this just kept on going deeper, deeper, deeper. We were just sort of staying with it, so that by that evening, I went over to Kevin Brown, who's the president of the university. I said, "Kevin, I think this could go on." "Oh, I know." He said, "We'll probably let it go till 9 o'clock or so tonight." I said, "No, honestly, I think if we don't stop it, then it won't stop." And so we gathered 5 or 6 down in the basement of Hughes Auditorium, and just sort of said, "What shall we do?" And we said, "Well, I think I can stay, and I will too. We'll call security and we'll just let it go. If it goes through the night, we'll let it go. We won't stop it." And that's all Jesus had to work with. There was not one thing special about anything in Wilmore, any of us, except maybe these two things. Those 5 or 6 people that fell in that life raft that we didn't get out of for 16 days, had no idea what we had just done when we fell in there. There was a lot of really tested, proven trust in that raft. It was deep relational integrity. That was just happened to be. And there was willingness. There was the willingness to be inconvenienced. There was the willingness to be interrupted. And, awakening does not move in big, flashy ways. At least in America, we can get so enamored with big events and, hype and, oh, it exploded and this happened and all these things. Awakening really moves at the pace of friendship, and among those who have eyes for the small. And if we can be tuned to see, wait a minute, no one's doing this, no one's pulling levers, no one's manufacturing this. God is doing this right now. It's unmistakable. And he grew that. You know what a cloche is? A little glass dome you put over a seedling just to protect it. We just cloached it. It was a tiny little sapling. We just put a cloche over it till it got its own stem strength and could stand, and we could take it off and it just kind of grew. I think all Asbury University became one big greenhouse over the students, allowing them to just kind of step up into what they were doing. And God grew that into something that began to capture the attention of the world. It was so astonishing to me. Hughes Auditorium became a throne room. I've never been in a room like this. There was no detectable line between earth and heaven in that room. Jesus was doing anything he wished in that room, and had so much access. There was, it was an outpouring of his presence. There was the altar, an old-fashioned altar rail up at the front. It never stopped. People were coming all day long, no matter what was happening. People were just coming. There was one time I was there to pray, and a young woman approached, and she was obviously from India, tears wet with face wet with tears. She knelt in front of me for prayer. And in broken English, she said, first words, "I am Hindu, and I have met him. And he is so beautiful." And I knew exactly what had happened. And I said, "Oh, he is. And I'm sure you would love to know him. So is there anything you would want to repent of?" And she put her hands out in front of her and herself and said, "Everything, all of me." And we prayed, and she received the Lord. And there had been no preaching and no invitation. And it was like that. It was just like fruit falling into our hands. It was like cutting through soft butter with a hot knife. I've grown so convinced, Owen, that the great need of our moment is the presence of Jesus. Just Jesus, when he's the evangelist and he's the discipler and the teacher and the healer and the deliverer in the room. And as any way that we can become non-leader leaders, if we can step off the stage and let him have our platforms, it's the John the Baptist call, I must decrease so that he can increase. And we're learning. I feel like that Jesus was doing so much in those 16 days, but there was also much that he was wanting to show us how he was doing it. It's almost like we've been ever since just reflecting on learning. That's what you and I were talking about, the Awakening Library. It's just nothing but this kind of long extended testimony of here's what we saw, not intended to be instructive or prescriptive, but descriptive and hopefully provocative. It's like, okay, how could we shift and adapt and move and relate to one another and pray in such a way that the presence of Jesus just becomes this unmistakable reality? You know, the place was flooded with people in their 20s. These were digital natives having the most analog experience of their lives. We had no tech, no screens, no nothing. And over the pipe organ in this room, and the holiness tradition said, "Holiness unto the Lord," in these big letters across the top. This is a generation known for moral fluidity, being drawn toward the message of holiness. It's like, how do you explain it except for the beauty of Jesus? We scratch our heads all the time about how could we attract Gen Z. And I feel like Jesus was saying, no, I'm going to use Gen Z to renew the church. I'm coming to them because and he did. And it was like they were moving in it. And so, yeah, it truly was the holiest and most extraordinary experience of my life. And we had been hopeful from reading revival history. We can take a lot of hope from the Welsh revival story. We were hopeful from reading the scriptures, but now we have a concrete hope. Jesus has, that's what it was for. It wasn't for Wilmore. It was for Cardiff. It really was. Jesus was saying, I want to get a story of hope to Cardiff, that I want to rescue this emerging generation. I want to come. And he is indicating that. I really do believe that we're sensing this kind of momentum and hunger rising. Everything that happened in Hughes Auditorium was the fruit of prayer, and I have never been so motivated to pray. I really feel like that this has come to stir our hunger and to really elevate prayer. So, yeah, I'm encouraged for what can happen in Wales.
So wonderful. There's so many threads to pull on there. The thing that really struck me watching Asbury from a distance was just this sense of understated power. There was such an understated humility baked into the whole thing. As you say, plain, simple, no lights and smoke machines, and seeing so-called well-known Christian figures traveling across the world and not being given a platform necessarily, but just being part of what God was doing there. And yeah, I want to honor you guys who are part of stewarding that, because I'm confident that commitment to an understated, humble approach was what enables there to be such life-changing power in that room over those days. I know, David, that you aren't just someone who's experienced firsthand a special outpouring of God recently, but I know that you're someone who's done extensive research, reading into the theme of awakenings in Scripture and history. And I wonder if you could just speak for a moment or two about what is it that prepares the way for an awakening in a city, in a region, in a nation? What is it that makes room for God to work in those kinds of ways? You've alluded to a few things there, but maybe just pull the thread on a couple of things that you would say prepare the way for God to move like that in our cities and nation.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah. Yeah. We were really moved in those days toward consecration. And this bears out in the awakening record is this desire to be rid of any impediment. You know, we cannot manufacture awakening, but we can remove impediments to it. We can posture ourselves to receive it, and we can cry out to God for it. And the call to consecration, this was something that that the students almost instinctively knew to do, so that the worship teams, anyone leading worship, was called into the consecration room. They named it that. They created it, and they were invited. You know, by day 4, we were running out of steam with worship teams, and they didn't want to stop. It was 24 hours a day. It was ministry of Jesus. Even in the empty auditorium, they kept ministry. They kept complete worship all going. But they were, you know, they just needed to begin getting volunteer teams. So they would identify them in the room prophetically and invite them into the consecration room. And this was a room where they were just confronting sin, reestablishing their identity in Jesus only. And I do really believe this is a time for those of us with awakening hope, desperate Christians. It's a time to just ask God, unearth in me, sift up out of me anything, even beyond my conscious awareness, sin that is not even known to me. Bring it to my knowing, bring it to my awareness, the deepest consecration we can know. You were referencing this earlier too, Owen. I've really come to believe that the quality of our relationships is not a sideline issue to our awakening hopes. And we know this. Sometimes I've wished that Jesus would have set any other condition for his presence than our relational health, because it's such hard work. But it's just what he said, you know, is where 2 or 3 agree, that's where I'm coming. If you're at the altar praying and you have a grudge, you might as well stop praying. Go work it out. And I think that now is a time for us to just ensure that all channels are open on our teams, in our families, in our friendships, in our past, in any direction. You know, we can't present a kind of a surface cursory unity and expect God to inhabit that with his glory. If there's anything across the line of race, this is awakening work when we're working on our relationships. And then we can actually bring a genuine and sincere spiritual unity to our praying. And then, of course, prayer. And I know that you all are moving in this. But this is the lesson of history, that it isn't quantity of prayer. It isn't that we just fill up the clock or fill up the room, but it is the temperature and depth of the prayer. It's the desperation. To what extent does the prayer bear the Gethsemane love of Jesus, the agonizing longing? And this is the thing that when I was doing this post-grad project on kind of the role of desperation in the work of God, I came across this idea of travailing prayer. Galatians 4:19, Paul, that I travail as if in the pain of childbirth, that Christ might be formed in you. A kind of agonizing, urgent, burdened, focused, pressing, that I first came across in the Hebridean revival of 1949 to 1952, where these parents and grandparents of men, young men who'd gone off to World War II, had come home with their faith shredded, completely lost. And they were just unwilling to cut a deal with that and just say, well, that's the price of war. No, God, these are our covenant children. You're a covenant making, covenant keeping God. We hold you to your covenant. Your honor is at stake. We must have you. Restore our children, restore our fortunes in this day. Revive your work. They were just a kind of a contending and a Jacob wrestling for the blessing, and a Hannah crying out for a baby, thought that she was drunk, of, like the early Christians just pleading with God before Pentecost and crying out for Peter's release from prison. And the prophets, we give God no rest, Isaiah 62, that we cling to God like a belt clings to a person's waist, Jeremiah 13, or the Psalms, tears flow from my eyes, for your law is not obeyed. We know that for us as Christians, tears are liquid words. God hears tears. He interprets tears. They are language. We pray for spirit-assisted prayer, and we thank God for everything that the third person of the Trinity has given to prayer: tongues and faith and knowledge and healing and every gift that he has assigned to prayer. But what we need even more now, I believe, than spirit-assisted prayer is the prayer of the Holy Spirit, which the Bible describes as unutterable groans, the groaning of God. The posture of prayer that I believe he's calling us to is to just say, God, author prayer in me. I don't need to inform you of anything. How do you say? I think the most important gift, spiritual gift for the praying we're after, is the gift of discernment. How can I see as you see and hear as you hear, so that it's your praying? I'll give it utterance. I'll add my faith to it. We'll wrap our unity around it, and then we'll watch you go to work. That really does. I really believe these things are what bear out in the record of awakening history. Nothing happens until this happens. This kind of unity and zeal and passion and fervor and brokenness in prayer, this is the primal work. Yeah, there's a point Charles Finney used to say in the Second Great Awakening. There's a point where Christians look at the world and they no longer just judge it and scorn it. They begin to pray for it earnestly. They start to weep over the condition of the world out of tremendous love, Gethsemane love. And he said, then you may expect revival. Indeed, it has begun already. The outpouring of the spirit of prayer is the first work. When you begin to sense prayers rising, and it's of a different manner, it's not about trying to have a big prayer event anymore. It's about the depth and heat of our praying. Then you can say, okay, God is helping us. He's getting us there. And that's when I think we can have great hopes for more.
Wow. So helpful, David. I mean, there's so much for us to take from that in what we're pursuing here in Cardiff. I even go back to something you shared earlier around, it's often the small places, it's the unimpressive places, it's the depth, as you say, of the prayer, and of the unity and of the relationship. And I think that all rings so true with what we're beginning to see stirring afresh here in Wales and in Cardiff. So that really does breathe great hope into us. Could continue this conversation for hours, but just one final question. This interview has initially been made, at least I already want to share it with everyone I know, but has initially been made for a gathering of leaders here in the city. I just wonder what you would say as a kind of parting word to particularly a gathering of leaders from different networks and streams and denominations who are coming together to consider this theme of united prayer. And maybe if you could just speak particularly within whatever message you'd have for us about that sense you have about Gen Z, because that was a huge part of what I've seen come out of what happened at Asbury was this gives hope for a whole generation. It's not just about an isolated 16 days, but it's a a first fruit potentially of what God is wanting to do in a generation. So would you just leave us with, parting word to a room full of leaders, and maybe just weave into that your hopes for this generation?
I'd love to, Owen. When we speak of revival and awakening, I think of that as a hunger for Christianity at its best. It's nothing more than just saying, God, we do want to be an answer to your prayer you taught us, that the kingdom of God would come on earth. You wouldn't have taught us to pray that if it couldn't happen. And you all live there in Wales, where it has happened. And I know that can feel so remote now that it almost feels like a burden. But if it has happened, it can happen again. And if it can happen again, it can happen in Cardiff or anywhere you're praying. Awakening for me is just shorthand for honesty. We are just Christians who are honest to admit that we are broken beyond repair. If more of our better programming or better preaching or better ideas, more energy, more ingenuity, if that were the solution, we would have had revival by now. We're the best resourced Christians who have ever lived. And look where we find ourselves. Human excellence is too small a thing. We must have something from the hand of God. Leonard Ravenhill used to say, there's nothing worse than a sick church in a dying world. We're up against a challenge beyond us. And it's either we cut a deal with it and just sort of close in and survive, or we say, you know what, I am unwilling to tolerate this. It's this tension of, there is a church I have fallen in love with in the New Testament, and there is the church of my everyday Welsh experience. And this difference is intolerable to me. I can't navigate it. I can't just sort of negotiate some compromise to it. I'm going to step into that gap, and I'm going to pray in that gap until Jesus closes that gap. And he must do it. And so I just would want to say to every man and woman in the room listening to this, you will never find a greater investment of your life than perhaps your own marriage and family, than to give yourself to awakening. You will never know. Why is it that we're still telling the story of Wesley? We're still telling the Hebridean story. And they don't know us. And we never knew them. But these moves of God, one way of really understanding the whole history of the church is just as a succession of awakening movements. Every innovation, every theological insight, all the great moves, all the missionary agencies, all the schools, all the everything, if you trace them back, they really emanated from some kind of renewing action of the Spirit. Everything that's happened, all the correction, all the it's the successive story of how God has just come back and restored. So when you're giving yourself to awakening work, you have the return on investment is far beyond anything you will ever know on this side. It's the most worthy. And I'll close with this about Gen Z. There was a study done by a group here in California called the Pine Tops Foundation. They did this 3.5-year project, took a year to write it up, and they named the project The Great Opportunity. And it was the coalescing of all this research that basically concluded, and at least in the United States, that if we stay on trend, unless there's an awakening or the Lord returns, and they marked out to 2050, about the arc of a generation, that we will continue to lose in the United States 1 million people, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, who would today, in even nominal ways, associate themselves with the Christian movement. We'll be losing them by 1 million a year. There's nothing to stop it, to the point that we'll lose about 42 million young. We won't feel that for another maybe 8 to 12 years, but it won't be long before it will just begin to, we're hemorrhaging them away. But they said, if we could just slow the decay, not even an awakening, but if we could just bleed slower, back to the levels where we were losing the young in Gen X, we would retain 20 of those 42 million. And that 20 million who would still be in the Christian movement that's more than all who came to faith in the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening, everything that came out of Azusa Street, and every Billy Graham crusade combined. That's why they called it the Great Opportunity. And I look upon it in that way, Owen. I just think, would we wait any longer for it to get worse before we start organizing our lives around awakening? This is, to me, a sell the farm, push all the chips to the center of the table moment of like whatever it takes. We're operating under a 5-alarm fire. We're raising our families under an urgent moment. And here's the thing. I find that Gen Z, we're losing them. But if we tap them on the shoulder before you walk out the door, could you just say, what is it? Why have you gone? They'll tell us. Any Christian young person, any Christian Gen Z, emerging adult who has come of age on a smartphone, who's come of age hooked up to a little 24/7 porn store, who's lived their life plugged into a little shame factory, reminding them all their lives of what they don't have and who they are not and who they're not with and what they're not doing, and lived through COVID and lived through the racial unrest and lived through this political fallout and all that they've been through, and they're still chasing Jesus. There's a clarity to them that I did not have at 20. They have a courage and a clarity that I liken to the Old Testament prophets. I think they've got the church by the collar and shaking and saying, are you looking at this? Are you paying attention? And what we found in the outpouring is anytime that we in my generation would try to step up and give it order and organizing, keep it moving, and with our experience and it just was there. But if we would step back and let the young step up, something surged up in it. We saw the empowerment of God on the young, the altar, and the worship. And we just said, and if we will just say, come on, we got your back. You just go ahead and try. It doesn't have to be polished. This was the outpouring was the triumph of presence over polish. The young felt it. They knew how authentic it was in the room. This was the toppling of celebrity Christianity. There was nothing, there was no performance to it, no production. It was so clunky and bumpy all the time. It was calm and sweet and clean and accessible, just what oversold church Gen Z needed. And if we will just make room, I find that the young, if they have the middles and elders in the room, and we can say to them, listen, you just go for it and be bold. And if it doesn't work, we've got your back and we'll pick you up and you'll get back on your feet and you'll try again smarter. That if they feel bold with us in the room and we feel so provoked and goaded by their hard questions, it causes us to be stirred in our own life, and we need them. I need them. And it's the final prophecy of the Old Testament coming into the Malachi 4 posture of like, we're in this together, hearts of the young toward the old, hearts of the old toward the young, and in the middle's right there in between it all. If we can move in a rank, a multi-generational rank, and let the young not just sort of be with us, but actually shape it, actually lead. And not just we're handing it off and say, oh, well, no, we're in it together, multi-generational, but actually have substantial kind of voice. And there's something of God that comes through that into this generation. And we must move boldly toward emerging adults. We just simply must. And I believe that the outpouring has just sort of given us a nudge to say, okay, get across bridge the generations, walk in it together, invite them in, and just see what they have to say, and let Jesus work through it. And I really believe he wants to and will.
Thank you, David, so much for that. That's just a rich deposit for us to be thinking on, but certainly turning into prayer. It's fuel for our crying out to God in our day. And that parting word reminding us of the power of generations coming together and God's plan in that. And for those of us who here in Wales may have lost some hope and faced with the challenges of the decline of the church in our day and similar outlooks, and in some cases probably bleaker here in the UK, it is just so good to be reminded that the Lord has a plan. He has a gospel that still saves. He has a spirit who is still brooding over the earth, and he has good in store for our city, our year. So thank you for going ahead of us and for sharing some of your insights and wisdom for us here in Wales. We really, really do appreciate it.
Bless you, Owen. Thank you so much for the honor, and God bless you in the rest of the meeting today.
Thank you, David. Wonderful. Here we go.